So after having his burning bush chat with God, Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said, "Hey, is it cool if I go back to Egypt to, make sure my friends and family are alive?" And Jethro was like, "Sure." Then God told him, "Oh, in case you're still worried about that guy you killed 40 years ago, everyone who was upset about that is dead now. So no one's gonna try and kill you once you go back to Egypt or anything." What a relief. And so Moses put his wife Zipporah and their 2 sons Gershom and Eliezer on a donkey and headed out of the land of Midian. And God said, "Okay, so when you meet the Pharaoh, you're gonna show him all the neat tricks I've taught you, but I'm gonna harden his heart so that he won't let your people go." Doesn't that defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do? Listen, this is gonna be our big debut into history, and the longer it takes the Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, the more opportunities we'll have to show Egypt and their furry idols my awesome power. By the time we're done with them, everyone will know that I'm the Lord with the capital everything, and Israel is my firstborn son. I guess that makes sense. But when do you plan to let it end? Probably after I kill the Pharaoh's firstborn son. Okay. And it's right after this exchange that we get the most confusing 3 verses in the entire book of Exodus. I'm now going to quote directly from the updated NRSV translation because it's the best one I found for this particular passage. "On the way, at a place where they spent the night, the Lord met him and tried to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin, touched his feet with it, and said, 'Truly, you are a bridegroom of blood to me.' So he let him alone. It was then that she said, 'a bridegroom of blood,' because of the circumcision." And then the narrative carries on, and these events are never referenced again. This whole bridegroom of blood passage is really f***ing bizarre. And I know that you all know that in these videos I might occasionally tweak or simplify something for the sake of entertainment, but this part of the Bible is hard to understand even if you're reading it in its proper context, so I think it deserves actual elaboration. And, yeah, that's what the rest of this video is gonna be. The Bridegroom of Blood episode is notoriously enigmatic because it's written as if it were pared down from an earlier, more detailed version. The conflict arises seemingly out of nowhere, and the phrasing makes it difficult to tell who is being talked about at any given time. The him who God is trying to kill is most likely Moses, but why would God want to kill the man he just chose to be his prophet and sent to Egypt? The son who Zipporah circumcises is usually thought to be Gershom, their firstborn, but it could just as easily be his little brother Eliezer. And either way, it's not explained why this act suddenly pacifies God. And on whose feet did Zipporah put the bloody foreskin? Again, it's most often assumed to be Moses, but the phrasing also makes it possible that it was their son or even God. Also, does the word feet actually mean feet, or is this a classic biblical euphemism for another part of the body? Last of all, who does Zipporah call her bridegroom of blood, and what the hell does that even mean? The first to write extensively on this passage were the rabbis, and one of their most famous Torah commentators was the medieval scholar Rashi. In his Exodus commentary, he infers that Moses had angered God by failing to circumcise his son in accordance with the law given in Genesis 17:12. Quote, "He who is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every male throughout your generations." So Rashi was assuming here that Moses' second son, Eliezer, was a newborn at the time of his call back to Egypt, which might sound far-fetched given Moses was 80 and his wife probably not far behind, but remember that profoundly geriatric pregnancies are not at all unheard of in the Torah. Anyway, this would have put Moses in a predicament. He had to go back to Egypt immediately, but it would of course be dangerous to circumcise a baby in the middle of a long journey through the desert. Moses opted then to postpone the operation until the first opportunity to perform it safely. And this was a fair compromise. However, Moses screwed up. Even after they stopped to rest, now almost to their destination, Moses continued procrastinating, and God lost his patience. Rashi then references a midrash, that is an expanded version of the story from rabbinic tradition, where Moses is attacked by an angel who takes the form of a serpent and tries to devour him, but it can't manage to swallow him past his groin. And from this, Zipporah gleans the protective power of circumcision and performs the operation on her son, thus resolving the problem. Midrash is really fun. When Zipporah says, "You are a bridegroom of blood odd to me, Rashi takes that to be directed at Eliezer. He believed the term to basically mean, "You are the reason my husband almost got killed," which was a little harsh to say to the kid, not gonna lie. It should be noted that other rabbinic commentaries present different takes on this part. The Jerusalem Talmud acknowledges Moses as an equally valid candidate for the title and suggests different ideas for what it would mean for each of them. There are also some who argue it was actually the son who was about to be put to death, as he was the one who lacked the protection of God's covenant mark. In this case, it's very tempting to read the previous passage where God threatens to kill the Pharaoh's firstborn as direct foreshadowing for this episode. You could take it as God not so subtly warning Moses what happens if you disobey him. And I think this is how the idea later arose that the elder brother Gershom was actually the son in question rather than Eliezer. It certainly makes more sense to me that he, presumably an adult, would be facing the consequences rather than a newborn with no agency. So yeah, minus the snake vor midrash, I haven't found any significant variations to these interpretations from traditional exegetes, be they Jewish or Christian. But things get quite a bit more interesting when we look at modern scholarship, like that of historian and prolific Exodus scholar William H.C. Propp. In his Exodus commentary, Propp notes that damim, the form of the word blood used by Zipporah, usually connotes blood guilt. Based on this, he argues Moses was indeed the one God was trying to kill, but not for failing to circumcise his sons. Instead, he's condemned for having killed a man in Egypt back in chapter 2. Now, in the Torah's law code, we're told that somebody guilty of manslaughter should be allowed to flee to a city of refuge where they'd be safe from capital punishment. They're to remain in exile until the death of the incumbent high priest. After that, the slate is clean and they can return home safely. Though this law would not be revealed to Moses for another several decades, Propp notes that he still seems to follow it in spirit. When his crime is exposed, he goes into exile in Midian, and he doesn't head back to Egypt until he's told that those with the authority to kill him are dead. But there's one necessary step missing as far as God is concerned. Before returning from exile, Moses still needs to make a formal atonement for his crime, and failure to do this is what provokes God's attack. Propp then infers that the author of this story understood circumcision to be a kind of purification ritual. So when Zipporah touches Moses' body with the blood of circumcision, he's able to share in that purification and be atoned for his crime. That raises the question though, why use one of their sons to circumcise Moses by proxy instead of just circumcising Moses himself? Well, the obvious assumption is that Moses was already circumcised. Even if his Hebrew parents didn't do it to him as a baby, he later would have had at least a partial circumcision according to Egyptian custom. But Propp has a more interesting theory. He points out that ancient Near Eastern people seem to have performed circumcision as part of a marriage rite, and this is likely where the term bridegroom of blood came from. Even after Israelite customs evolved from that into what we now see in the Bible, the term may still have been in use, both in the context of marriage and in circumcision, despite the original meaning having been forgotten. So this strange episode in the Moses narrative involving a husband bearing blood guilt, his wife, and their circumcised son could have been invented in an attempt to explain why their people started saying bridegroom of blood. And now that I've summarized some interpretations by a few acclaimed scholars and theologians, it's time for a new segment called Jake's Ignorant Layman Hot Take. I am not a biblical scholar. I can't even read Hebrew, as many of you already know. But it, here's my take anyway. Now, since I can't speak with authority on language, history, or theology, I can only make sense of the bridegroom of blood episode based on how I think it fits into the broader story of Moses' life. Moses spent the first 40 years of his life among Egyptian royalty, but apparently he knew the whole time that he was born a Hebrew slave and considered them to be his people. So even though he lived in luxury in the Pharaoh's palace, he must never have felt truly at home there. He'd always be wondering what his life should have been like with his real family. And so one day Moses goes to see just what it's like for the Hebrews, and he's appalled by the injustices they suffer. But when he starts trying to help his people, he's flatly rejected. Simultaneously, he's thrown away the option to continue living as an Egyptian. Moses has no choice then but to abandon the closest thing to a home and the closest thing to a cultural identity he's ever had. I think this would have been crushing. So by the time he settles in Midian and starts a family with Zipporah, I don't see why Moses would give a hoot about raising their children according to Hebrew customs. In his mind, he's no more a Hebrew now than he is an Egyptian, or a Midianite for that matter. He's a stranger in a strange land, and he's never been anything else. But then, then, after another 40 years of not quite having a place worth calling home, Moses meets the God of Israel. The Lord takes Moses' identity as a Hebrew for a given and charges Moses with liberating his people from Egypt. Moses understandably has no interest in taking this job. He doesn't want a repeat of the last time he tried to help the Hebrews against Egypt's tyranny. But after a long back and forth, he runs out of excuses not to follow God's order, and so he reluctantly starts heading back to Egypt. Now, I don't know why God wants to kill Moses. Maybe for failure to circumcise his sons, maybe as punishment for manslaughter. They're both well-reasoned arguments, and further speculation by me wouldn't be worth much. What I will speculate on is what was going on in Moses' head during this episode. Here he is reluctantly following the orders of a God he doesn't consider his, then suddenly that same God is trying to kill him for some slip-up he made along the way. Maybe Moses is thinking, alright, fine. I didn't want to do this anyway. In fact, I told you I'd mess it up somehow, and apparently I have. So let's just get this over with. But then, totally unexpectedly, his wife springs into action. By circumcising their son, she enters him into the God of Israel's covenant, and by touching Moses with the blood and proclaiming their relation out loud, she makes him too part of this initiation. This to me is Zipporah taking the situation into her own hands and effectively saying to her husband, if you won't decide who you are, then I will. We are Hebrews now, the people of the Lord, God of Israel. Our fate is tied to Israel now. So if you love me and our son, you'll go to Egypt and free our people as God commanded. And this gesture not only pacifies God, but just as crucially, it pushes Moses into finally accepting his identity as a Hebrew and servant of God. Now, this might seem like an unfair way of forcing Moses to resolve his identity conflict, and to that I say, yeah, Moses' life is really messed up and it doesn't get better from here. But I do think it was a genuine relief for him to finally, after 80 years, decide who he is and what his purpose is. The path ahead would not be easy, but at least he would finally have a clear path to follow. Now, I wish I had more time to explore other scholarly analyses of these 3 weird Bible verses. All the commentaries I talked about in this video, and many more which informed my understanding of this passage, will be linked in the doobly-doo. I want to specifically highlight Carmen Joy Imes' video series, Torah Tuesday, where she highlights the theme of Moses' identity conflict in the Bridegroom episode. And also Dr. Richard Friedman's Torah translation and commentary, where he presents a very unique take on the passage. It's from him where I got the idea that Moses might not have been resisting God's attack. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Hopefully my next Exodus video won't involve so much talk about dick.